through a lecture. So if you wanted to follow along with today's mini lecture, the files are in that folder, the week 1 folder. You guys here in Augusta, I printed out some extras if you want one, if you want to have a hard copy to write on. Again, these are not required, but I find them very helpful. So, so what I would like to do, yes, is lecture for less than an hour, I think. We can take a little break, and I'll walk you through your participation assignment for today as well before we leave. Sound good? All right. And to those of you on Zoom, again, I sometimes get excited and try to move on too quickly. If you ever need me to slow down or go back a slide, I am not offended if you just unmute and say, oh, excuse me, could you go back a second? Or, please hold on. Like, it's fine. No judgment. I get it. So, and you guys too in Augusta, you can also do that, but you can more easily just wave me down. So
I have a quick question, Professor.
Of course.
So unfortunately, I'm in quarantine right now, but next Thursday, I will be able to be on the Bangor campus. Do you know, do they print out the outlines for us at the sites, or should we print them out ahead of time?
Yeah, I don't think they will be. You could call and double check, but I have not been providing one since they're in Brightspace. I don't know if they've been able to access them. So I would say they're probably not going to be doing that, and to do it beforehand.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Any other questions for now? And if you're enrolled in an on-site location, so Maria, you're a perfect example. You want to usually attend live in Bangor, but anytime you can't, you can attend live on Zoom if that's a possibility for you, right? No matter what section you're enrolled in. So, or if you childcare issues or you have to quarantine or whatever, feel free to join the live Zoom anytime. And again, anybody who's live and needs to do delayed viewing can do that as well. So, alrighty. So just to set the stage for this semester and this course is called Social Problems, but it is an SOC class, meaning it's a sociology class. So just to refresh your memories from Intro to Sociology, sociology is defined as the systematic study of individuals, groups, and social structures. Individuals, groups, and social structures. And hopefully that refreshes your memory that sociology deals with things at the micro level, the small scale, right? Individuals, all the way up through things like social structures, which are like the frameworks of society, like religion and education and government and economics and whatever else. So big and small. And really, sociology is about examining the relationships between individuals and society, right? Individuals and society, it's micro and macro. And finally, the book mentions the idea that sociology is an objective and systematic approach to understanding the causes of social problems. So because this course is not Intro to Sociology, we're specifically focusing on problems in society. Using sociology to study social problems is good because it's objective, which means it's not subjective. It's not open to interpretation. It's about looking at evidence and data that supports things, right? And it's systematic. And as we'll see at the end today, we follow the scientific method in social sciences and in sociology. And it allows us to really understand the causes of social problems by looking at things like poverty or homelessness or violence or whatever. So what are social problems? What about this class, right? What are we focusing on? Well, we are focusing on social conditions that are perceived to be problematic by groups of people. Social conditions that are perceived to be problematic by groups of people. Not just things that are problematic, but things that people think are problematic. It turns out there's a lot of things that are social problems that actually don't affect a lot of people. And then there's a lot of things that affect a lot of people that we do not see as social problems. And so it's really important to note that it's members of society who determine what is and is not defined as a social problem. It turns out it's kind of like, oh shoot, what am I thinking of? In some fantasy, and I don't remember what fantasy world it is, you have to, well, like, okay, so like in Harry Potter, where if they use Voldemort's name, right, it gives him more power, right? A social problem is only a social problem when we call it a social problem, right? Naming it as a problem is what makes it a problem. So the name has power, but we'll get to that. So far, so good. I don't think any of these definitions are like shocking, right? So because whether or not something is a problem depends more on like who defines it and less on what it actually is, we can say that social problems are socially constructed. And if you took intro social with me, you heard me say that phrase a million times, right? Blah, blah, blah is socially constructed. What that means is that ideas or beliefs are based on social perceptions that vary from society to society and over time. We are influenced by the society and the time period that we live in, right? You know, when you got dressed this morning, you probably chose between, you know, jeans and sweatshirts and things like that. But if we lived in another time period, you might have been choosing between, you know, hoop skirts and knickerbockers and whatever else, right? Or if we lived in in India, you might be choosing between a kurta or a sari, or right, like our reality, our everyday reality is shaped by where we live and when we live and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And that's because as human beings, we assign meaning to the world around us. And so we say, you know, these things are clothing, or this is the kind of things that are food, or this is what good music is, or whatever. We assign meaning to the world around us. And in fact, we are influenced by two things when we live, right? The two things are on the next slide. So does everyone have what they need here? Okay. The two things we're influenced by are culture and social structure. Our culture and our social structure. These are both terms from Intro to Sociology, but just as a recap, culture refers to rules and values and beliefs and material goods, you know, physical objects that are created by members of a society. Rules, values, beliefs, and material goods created by members of a society. I know I didn't give you a lot of room in that line to write all that stuff, but you know, it's all the stuff that's culture. The other thing we're influenced by is the social structure. That's the big picture parts of society, right? The framework of society that is constructed through institutions. Institutions are things like government, education, families, religion, economics, medicine. Oh, that's already on there. No, it's not. Okay. Anyway, a whole bunch of things are institutions in society, as we will see.
Real quick, I'm sorry, I missed the individuals assign. I missed that one apparently.
Oh, that's okay. Meaning to the world around them.
Thank you.
Of course. And so, yeah, so the way we find that meaning is through our culture and our social structure. So this is not a history class, and I'm not a history professor, but I do want to give you a little context about where the reason social problems are so often studied in sociology. So I'm not going to test you on these dates, don't worry, but sociology was kind of born in roughly 1840 is kind of the year that we trace it back to Karl Marx and the publication of his book Capital. Not the Communist Manifesto. That's politics. We're talking just social science here. But anyway, before he published that, though, There was like 100 years of chaos in the world, right? All these different kinds of revolutions were happening around the world. There was one called the Industrial Revolution, which you probably read about or heard about in school before, right? Where everything was becoming mechanized and factories coming up, and no longer were we like agrarian society. We were a manufacturing society, and pollution and coal and I don't know, all that kind of stuff, right? That was chaotic for people. Also during this time was an economic revolution, specifically the revolution of capitalism, right? This new kind of form of money and profit and work, and it was all different than it was before. There were a whole bunch of political revolutions during this time. The most salient one for us being the American Revolution of 1776, but also the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. There's probably others that I don't know about, but lots of revolutions occurring during this time. So all around the world, you know, the peasants are overthrowing the monarchy or the aristocracy, right? And then social revolutions associated with like people moving en masse to cities, right? Cities didn't exist in the 1700s, but suddenly by, 1905, cities were everywhere, right? And so all of the fathers of sociology, all of the kind of early theorists who became sociologists were all born and raised during this chaotic time. And so classical sociological theorists and theories emerged as a way to explain the chaos. They all grew up hearing or seeing all the chaos around them and wanting to be able to explain it. Why is the world in chaos? Perhaps some of you feel that way currently, right? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to explain why we are doing what we are doing around the world, just in general, right? So you can see why it might have piqued their interest. I am not going to test you on millions of names and dates and dead white guys and all that kind of stuff, right, in this class. But I do want to introduce you to two sociologists who were really instrumental in studying social problems. So these are the only two names you might want to remember, but still no dates are needed. So the first one is a woman by the name of Jane Addams. Jane Addams lived from 1860 to 1935, so she was born, right at the end of a century of chaos. And she is famous in sociology because she established something called the Hull House in Chicago. Hull House was one of the first settlement houses in the U.S. A settlement house is a place where college students could live and work, but while also serving the communities that they were in. Right. So imagine like a dorm where all the students at the dorm have to, work at a soup kitchen or volunteer with a housing authority or help. Like if that dorm also was a community outreach center, right, where all the students worked. And so settlement houses were built usually in either poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods where there were a lot of immigrants, like people coming to the U.S. and not really knowing how to live. And so settlement houses were there to help, teach people how to become members of society. While they were there, the students would conduct research on issues of social inequality and would advocate for policies and laws to address those issues that they saw. So they were literally researching and trying to solve social problems in these settlement houses. They fought for issues like child labor laws. The ACLU started out of a settlement house, the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP as well. And Jane Addams actually was a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize co-winner in 1931 because of her work solving social problems in Chicago. So this is Jane Addams, for anyone who likes to put a face to a name. That's Jane Addams. Any questions about her? So she was an early, social action kind of person. Another one whose name you may have heard before is W.E.B. Du Bois. He's kind of in the last few years with more and more attention being paid to Black scholars and social scholars. W.E.B. Du Bois' name comes up a bit more often. His timeline was 1868 to 1963, so he lived after all those centuries of chaos, or the century of chaos. He grew up in a poor black neighborhood in Philadelphia. He went away to school, and then he came back and lived in the same neighborhood, like bought a place or, rented a place or whatever, and lived in the same neighborhood that he grew up for 2 years. And while there, he conducted over 5,000 interviews with the residents of that poor neighborhood. And he combined those interviews with census data to create maps that illustrated social and economic conditions of the community. I'm going to show you some of these maps in a second because they're so awesome, given that they were done in, the turn of the century, the last century. So while he lived there over 2 years, he interviewed everyone in this neighborhood. He looked at census data, and he created these visual representations of what these neighborhoods looked like. So before I show you the images he made, this is W.E.B. Du Bois when he emigrated to the U.S. from Paris. And this is him shortly before his death in the 60s. I just love this portrait. I think it's so cool. But so he took these are things that he drew freehanded, right? Nowadays we have, data, like we have, computers can do all this, but like, this is crazy. And so like, this is a map of Georgia, and he used, census data to, track the population percentages of those who were Negro, meaning African-American, and other other racial groups around the state between, 1870 and 1880. So showing, changes in racial demographics. Here's another cool chart he designed that is meant to illustrate the difference between the city and the rural population in a particular area, right, in 1890. Here's something we would simply a pie graph. Like you can see the individual marker stripes, that he made these by hand. They're so cool. This was the occupations of people, blacks and whites in Georgia at the time. These ones I'm showing you happen to be Georgia just because I thought they were cooler looking, but he did them for Philadelphia too. This is where where Georgia African Americans can trace their lineage to, and some more, just more bar graphs and stuff. So he was an early what we call visual sociologist, which is a really cool area of research that I'm into. And so he helped show, issues in neighborhoods, issues in states, issues with race visually. So those are two cool sociologists, Jane Addams and W.E.B. Du Bois. But I want to go back to the idea that I said at the end of the last section, which was members of society just define what is and is not a social problem, right? So that begs the question, like, why are some things considered social problems, but not others? Like, why do we as a society think that, heart disease is a problem medically, but mental health isn't? I think we acknowledge mental health, but you know what I'm trying to get at, right? Why are some things problematic and others not? Well, the book uses a really funny example to show how quickly popular representations in the media and things can trick us into thinking things are scary and bad. So how many of you grew up being afraid of quicksand, like every day or whatever? Anyone? No, some. So I'm seeing slightly older folks, right, on the spectrum. That's okay. People in their 30s and 40s and older are more likely to say yeah than people in their teens and 20s, because for decades quicksand was portrayed in the media, like in movies and things, fictional, but still as this thing that everybody kept dying from, right? So it started in 1962. Lawrence of Arabia was the first movie that really, there was like a little boy who dies after falling into the quicksand. And then there were quicksand scenes in Lone Ranger and all the local little TV shows at the time. I saw some research they presented in the book. There were quicksand scenes in 1 out of every 35 movies released in the 1960s. That's a lot of quicksand, especially considering A, it doesn't exist in the way that it's portrayed. Like there's no thing that you just like fall into, right? And B, it's definitely not common in the United States, right? In fact, by 2010, they, like you can see it drops off, right? People had stopped. There wasn't so much quicksand in the media, right? In movies. And so people who are of younger generations, 20s, early 30s, right? They're like, yeah, I've heard of quicksand, but I'm not like afraid of it every day, right? But for generations, people were terrified of quicksand because it was everywhere in the media. It just goes to point out, right? Our fears are not always rational. They're sometimes, you know, instigated by what we see around us, right? Whether it's real or not real. So yeah, by now kids can like learn for themselves, just Google quicksand and they'll learn, oh, it's not going to be an issue in my life, right? So, but yeah, those of us before Google, man, we were terrified. I'd carry a big stick just in case, right? Just kidding. So we know that social problems are defined by people, but we also know that social problems do not have to affect a large number of people for them to be perceived as dangerous problems for society. So, for example, I mean, statistically, right, if you look at people who do not have homes, right, homelessness, that affects, I think it's between 10 and 12% of the population. I'm not sure. It could be a little higher given the economic insecurities of the pandemic and stuff. But statistically speaking, that's not a large percentage of the population. Yet we consider, you know, unhomed persons to be a, you know, a problem, right? We dedicate time and resources to trying to solve those problems. But we also know that problems that affect large numbers of people, and I already kind of said this, are often not seen by society as social problems. Think about the opioid epidemic, for example, right? Especially if you think about victims of that epidemic as not just being folks who OD or who pass away, but like their families and their communities, right? That affects a huge percentage of the population across the US. But we aren't really seeing, or we haven't been seeing as much, you know, attention being paid to that as, you know, the war on drugs or whatever, right? Why do you think that is? Why is it that like sometimes things just aren't seen as problems, even when they really are? Any thoughts? Yeah.
You don't always see it. Like with mental health for a while, you can't see mental health problems as visually as you can see a person in a wheelchair. Mm-hmm. And so that's one big aspect.
So problems are more visible or more in your face or whatever than others are. Absolutely, visibility. Why else?
Onto this power.
Yes, yes, power is one of them. Do you know what about power?
Well, they have the ability to make things visible and make things seen, whereas, you know, people who struggle with addiction and things like that, they don't have that power to outline it for everybody.
Absolutely. A lot of the social problems in society are problems that affect people who don't have a lot of power, right? The poor, you know, people who aren't in like don't have political power, right? Like average people, women or minority groups, racial and ethnic minorities, right? And so, yeah, largely this can be tied back to the concept of power. And so how that works, and so the word was power there, I just want to, social conditions must be perceived as problems in order to become problems. That's kind of restating what was on the last slide, but here's the new thing. Those with more power in society have the most influence over what people believe. Those with the most power in society have the most influence over what people believe. The producers of Lawrence of Arabia had the power to convince generations of children that they were going to fall into quicksand at any moment, right? Because they had power in the form of, you know, their message got out to a large audience, right? So people with high positions in the social structure can influence laws, media, economics, education, government, healthcare, real estate, I don't know, I could keep talking, but you get the idea, right? Everything. They can influence everything. Questions or comments about that? And if you took intro sociology, this is probably not a shocker, like we've already talked about, you know, powerful people get to run things for better or for worse. And that includes running our perceptions of what's a problem and what isn't. But there's good news, right? It doesn't mean that we're always just subject to the whims of the powerful. In fact, ordinary people can gain power when they organize themselves and work together. That's why social movements are so powerful. Things like, you know, the NAACP has been around for 60, 70, 80 years because it was an organization of people who didn't have a lot of power when it started, right? In this case, Black Americans. But they were able to organize themselves and work together to form this social movement organization that has brought significant change in the last, 70 or 80 years. It doesn't have to be a social movement, but the idea is when people work together, and you don't have to write all these, you don't have to write them down anyway, but when people work together, they can identify goals more readily, they can form organized groups, create strategies, mobilize resources, organize actions, and build power to reach their goals. So you don't have to be a powerful individual, you can work with others to pool your power, and that can be effective. Here's an example of how effective it can be. So in the United States, we have marriage equality, right, which means that any adult person can marry another adult person. But before the Marriage Equality Act, there was a battle on people trying to win over people's opinions about whether gay individuals would be able to marry legally. And so the movement that led to the success of the marriage equality movement followed the same steps of, identifying goals and mobilizing resources and getting people on board. And they were able to change society's perceptions of same-sex marriage and the laws surrounding it. And I can offer you visual data that shows over 10 years, the 10-year period between 2007 and 2017, so a 10-year period, people's views on supporting same-sex marriage. So these are just generations, millennials, Gen Z, boomers, and the silent generation. But as you can see, in 2007, this is the percent of people that supported gay marriage. And by 2017, every single generation was higher, right, than it was 10 years before, meaning every group increased their acceptance over 10 years. It jumped across all of the generations. It went from an average of 37% to 62% of people supporting. So much so that it culminated in a Supreme Court decision, Albertville versus Hodges in 2015, that made it nationally the law, right, that of marriage equality. So individual gay activists and individual marriage activists, right, may not have been able to affect change, but by working together in a social movement, you can see tangible change in people's ideas, right? They changed perceptions of something being a problem. Does that make sense? So normally in this class, because it's so long, I'll usually try to take a break around between 2 and 2:15, somewhere in there to give you guys a break. But I have only a very little bit left. So if you guys are cool with it, I'd rather just power through, and then we'll get out pretty early. Is that okay? All right. If you're out there and you need a break, go take your break, and then you can just watch the recording later. But we're pretty close. So this brings me to our sort of final section here today, which is solving social problems. And I told you at the beginning, we're going to look at a lot of problems and causes, but I don't want to neglect the solutions. And the good thing about sociology is it's really committed to social change. It's not just about finding out what is, but also about how we can fix it. And so the book talks about these two tools that sociology gives you as an activist in society, right? The first is developing a sociological eye. A sociological eye is something that allows you to see beneath the surface of society and to recognize social patterns. To see beneath the surface of society and recognize social patterns. So by taking sociology classes like intro and also this one, you are being trained to not just take things at face value, right? Not to just say, here, 300 people died of overdoses today, right? But instead to look beneath the surface and to recognize patterns and ideally to use those patterns to inform, solutions. So the first part is recognizing patterns, and then the second tool that you gain in sociology is social activism, which is understanding, publicizing, and addressing unjust patterns. Unjust patterns. And so first we need to see what is, and then we need to understand what we can do to change what is, if we so choose. Or to maintain what is if we like what it is, either way. So this all comes from the idea of the sociological approach to studying society, as opposed to, let's say, like the psychological approach, right, which is valid and has its own strengths, but focuses primarily on individuals and their perceptions, right? The sociological approach invokes something called the sociological imagination, which is just a fancy phrase that refers to the ability to connect personal experiences with public issues or the broader social context. Right? The ability to connect personal experiences with public issues. And so at the beginning, when I was talking about small scale and large scale, right, individuals and society, you and your personal experiences are important because they're your perspective on the world, but they're just you, right? And sociology shows you how to connect your experiences on the individual level with the broader public issues or social context above you, right? And so a sociologist by the name of C. Wright Mills, you don't need to remember his name, but I want to give him credit. C. Wright Mills made the distinction here between personal troubles and public issues. Excuse me. Personal troubles, here's my notes, there we go. Personal troubles are exactly what you think, they sound like, right? Problems that affect individuals only, or maybe like individuals and a few people around them. But compared to society, it's just a blip on the radar, if anything, right? If I were to lose my job, right, that would be a personal trouble. It would suck for me, and it would probably suck for, the people around me. But largely speaking, society wouldn't notice, right? Public issues, on the other hand, have an effect on large numbers of people. And not just that, it's not just large numbers of people, but also public issues can only be solved through social action. Personal troubles can theoretically be solved by the individual, right? If I lose my job, I can then do things to change that. I can go back to school and get more training, or I can apply for other jobs, or I can go on unemployment, or I can do things to change that situation. I may not succeed in all of them, but I at least have options. But public issues can't be solved by one person. They require people working together. Take the pandemic, for example, right? No matter how much we would love it, if one person could just swoop in and fix it, right? It's going to require all people working together. It requires social action to solve that public issue. So when do personal troubles become public issues? Could my losing my job somehow spiral into a public issue? Maybe not me personally, but sometimes it can, right? If the personal trouble is one that is being held by the President of the United States, that probably is going to affect more people than, just me, right? Or if the personal trouble is something that has a ripple effect, right? Like I lose my job, so I can't pay my taxes, so they can't fund the shelter, so there's more homeless people, or whatever, right? It can have a ripple effect. The best way to describe how personal troubles become public issues that I've read is by a woman, a sociologist named Donnaline Lasecki, who wrote, conditions might exist, and people might even be hurt by them, but conditions are not social problems until humans categorize them as troublesome and in need of repair. So again, if a thing is not a problem, even if it's bad for society, it's not a social problem until we call it out as a social problem. And that's why people are always fighting to have the government, recognize some issue, or to have leaders, call attention to some problem, right? Because until it's brought to everyone's attention and called a problem, it's never going to get solved. So for our activity today, I want to walk you through it, and then you can do it, we're going to get out early, so you'll have like an hour of time that you can do it during, or you can do it sometime this week, it doesn't matter.